should we understand, Ambassador Volker, an upgraded joint military exercise between the Philippines and the United States? When it comes to the number, of course, it's 9,000, not necessarily significant compared to last year. And yet, when you look at the countries, Japan likely to join, and also it is becoming ever nearer to the disputed islands between China and the Philippines.
Well, what you see over the last several years is a growing Chinese military capability and Chinese military presence in the South China Sea, including the land reclamation and the putting of some military infrastructure on some disputed islands, which other nations also claim in addition to China. So this has raised a lot of concern among a lot of countries in the region that they're seeing the balance change. They're seeing that China is asserting its military presence much more. And so that has caused them to want to re-examine their own military capabilities, their own relationship with each other, their own relationship with the United States, in order to show that they do have capabilities there and to, in a way, to push back a little bit on what they see as what had been unchecked Chinese steps moving forward, hoping that this creates a little bit of pushback and a little bit more balance.
So, Mr. Ambassador, if I understand right, this is targeting at China.
I think it's a response to what they've seen over the last few years of China's increased capabilities and increased use of its military in laying claim to these islands in the South China Sea. And as you know, the U.S.-Philippines military relationship goes back decades and decades. But in the past 20 years or so, it had really fallen off. And there is an effort now, I think, to get it back onto a little bit stronger footing.
Getting it back will need a common enemy sometimes. Professor Heydarian, is China the common enemy?
Well, on the paper, the Balikatan exercises are supposed to be an expression of U.S.-Philippines security alliance. It's also supposed to be about helping the Philippines in terms of disaster relief and humanitarian operations. But of course, we know that the texture, the trajectory, and nature of these exercises over the past few years have been more and more directed towards what's happening in the South China Sea. So for instance, the exercises are happening in Palawan, which is very close to the contested features in the South China Sea. And this year, the United States used more advanced hardware like certain strategic missiles. Australia also has dispatched special forces to contribute to the Balikatan exercises. And of course, now you have Japan for the very first time in 15 years also sending a submarine to the Philippines. I think in a lot of ways, a lot of signaling is happening here. Operationally speaking, I don't think there's much gain out of the Balikatan exercises, not a very significant one. But I think a lot of political messaging is happening here. Essentially, US and the Philippines and allied countries are saying that if China keeps on increasing its military presence across the area, there will be a corresponding augmentation of interoperability and somehow perhaps a counter alliance in the region. And I think that's a very clear message that everyone is sending. And it's important to see what kind of improvements or expansion in the presence of Australia and Japan and other US spokes in the region.
Mr. Yang, sitting here in Beijing, you listen to your colleagues coming from the US and the Philippines. Has China really got the message? If China gets the message, likely to be any reaction from this part of the world?
Well, I cannot say it's China will get a reaction, but China will be pulled into interaction. We have been in the course of the interaction. Unfortunately, it's adversely. For example, many Americans say or Filipinos say China is getting more and more assertive. But in nature, if you look at the whole course, China, if we can say assertive, China is conducting a reactive assertiveness. For example, constructions on islands, China is not the very first comer. China is really a real late comer. During the past 10 years, China did nothing between 2000 and 2010. It was the Philippines and the Vietnam, the others, do a lot of construction, including the airstrips and so on. China stayed calm. Why? Because China didn't think the balance was broken. When U.S. start started the so-called rebalance strategy, and they claimed we, the United States, will redeploy our 60% of the military forces in the Western Pacific. China was got alert. You know, a super military power input 60% of military forces here. Then what China has to do? Reaction.
Well, Mr. Ambassador said it very clearly earlier from the U.S. that it seemed that China has been increasing its military powers over the past 20 years, and the U.S. was claiming they were doing reactive actions in a way toward China's increasing spending in military budget and also its power in the Western Pacific. So how would you respond to that, Mr. Yang?
Well, objectively speaking, your question is a question of kitchen and the egg. We can criticize, we can figure at each other between China and the US. Say, you come first, or you do first, and I do second. But in fact, the two countries, because of the series of action and reactions, we are falling trust deficit. All the interactions between China and the U.S. in South China Sea, including China and the Philippines, are based in deficit trust.
Here's the thing, Mr. Heydarian, first of all to you. Are we going to see the security guarantee of the country of yours, for example, the Philippines, or others in the Western Pacific, as a result of this kinds of upgraded military exercise with the United States, which China already gets alerted, as all of you want, I mean all of the countries want, necessarily going to bring you more security, I mean the country of the Philippines?
Well, I think there's a lot of back and forth on whose fault it is and who triggered this dispute. Of course, some of us who carefully followed the South China disputes, we would say that it was in 2009 that really disputes entered the new stage when Vietnam and Malaysia filed their claims at the United Nations, and in response, China published its 9-dash line. And over the next succeeding years, we saw a tit for tat between China and the United States and other countries in the region. But I think for us to get a proper sense of what's happening in the region is to see how countries across ASEAN, from Malaysia to Indonesia to Philippines to Vietnam, and even further to Japan, among others, all of them have been raising concerns with China's rising assertiveness in the South China Sea. So this is not only about China and the United States, it concerns a lot of countries in the region who are also worried about the trajectory of China's claims and assertiveness in the area. Now, obviously, for the Philippines, there is a sense that because they're among the weakest countries in military terms, and because they have not yet developed their minimum deterrence capability, they need to get the maximum possible assistance from the United States. And as correctly pointed out a while ago, over the past 20 years, the Philippines-U.S. relations have experienced some sort of stagnation. And it's only under the U.S. rebalancing to the region that the Philippines has been experiencing more assistance from the United States. But the assistance that the United States provides to the Philippines is still very limited compared to the billions of dollars it gives to its allies in the Middle East, like Egypt, Israel, among other things. So the hope for the Philippines is that increasingly, as the tensions in the South China Sea rise, the United States will give more foreign military financing to the Philippines, will help it to develop its minimum deterrence and domain awareness capabilities. And more importantly, the Philippines wants eventually the United States to give a guarantee that in an event of dispute in the South China Sea between them and China, the United States will help them. But so far, there has been no such kind of guarantee. But so far, what we see under the Balikatan exercises is that more effort by the U.S. and other allies to enhance the Philippines' own ability to defend its claims.
From what Professor Heydarian just said, Ambassador Volker, it seems that it sounds like a child. I'm not saying Mr. Professor was like a child, but rather the country itself sounds like a child. Whoever has the biggest sounds of the crying will necessarily going to get the U.S. Attention, and therefore probably more financial allocation resources and also the military support. But the question really is, Mr. Ambassador, has U.S. ever thought about this before? That this kind of exercise, especially upgraded every year, is it going to bring peace to the region, or it's upping the chances of possible conflicts?
So, of course, the U.S. has been involved with security in the Western Pacific, in guaranteeing the freedom of navigation, and in policing international waters, if you will, in the Western Pacific, really since the end of World War II. And has had a very strong alliance with a number of countries there, South Korea, with Japan, with the Philippines. And what we've seen over 40 to 50 years was relative calm and peace and stability. The U.S., as we said earlier, had a very substantial military relationship with the Philippines.
But Mr. Ambassador, I have to
with Clark Base.
I have to interrupt. My question really is: will these kind of upgraded joint military exercise, which China is very much aware it is being targeted, necessarily going to bring peace to the country in the region and the West Pacific, or it's more likely to upping the chance of possible conflict, whether it's small scale or, God bless us, larger scale in the future? That is really the question.
Well, yes, and that's exactly the point. That's exactly the point that I wanted to get to, is we had a very long period of peace and stability with a substantial U.S. military presence working with a variety of countries. This has changed partly by a reduction in the U.S. presence from the 90s to mid-2000s and early 2010s, and partly with a substantial increase in China's military capability and military activity. So to get this back into balance, we're seeing the U.S. rebalance towards Asia. We're seeing some of the countries in the region renew some of their own capabilities and build relationships with each other. I think that will restore some balance. In the absence of that, I think it's more likely to see some conflict, as there'll be some miscalculation as China continues to expand its military engagement, and unclear where there might be pushback from countries in the region or from others.
I want a very, very short follow-up with you, Mr. Ambassador, and also a short answer as well. U.S. ever described rebalance to Asia as a trade and economic strategy. But from what both of you and the Filipino guests have indicated, it's really a military strategy, is it? Very brief answer from you, and then we go to the Chinese guest.
It's a comprehensive strategy.
All right, let's come back
It's a comprehensive strategy. What the U.S. said, Europe and Middle East, less, Asia more.
Okay, let's come back to Mr. Yang. So, the kinds of weapons have been upgraded in the military exercise. The military exercise is getting ever closer geographically to the disputed islands between China and the Philippines. And also we see the country of Japan, which China still has issue about territorial disputes with, and also the change of its constitution with, has also been brought in for this year. What would China do, really, Mr. Yang? And meanwhile, there's reports suggesting, I'm not saying confirming, but suggesting U.S. is likely in the recent days to have another chance to challenge the territorial integrity of some countries who owns islands in the South China Sea. Once again, how will China react to that? Can China and others be able to still find a mechanism to maintain peace while all of these actions are going on all at the same time?
Well, briefly speaking, two hands. On one hand, China will certainly increase efforts of military capabilities to prepare dealing with the new challenges, because all the signals we mentioned are increasing pressures on China militarily. So China need to strengthen the military capabilities to deal with this new situation. And on the other hand, China will input more efforts for diplomacy solution. We need to get a peaceful solution by negotiations. Basically, China has called for dual-track negotiations, dual-track solution. On one hand, all the directly related parties, say claimant countries, sit together or bilateral negotiation to talk about, negotiate about solution to the disputes. That's the business between China, the Philippines, the Vietnam, and others. So that's one track. The other track is all surrounding countries about China, South China Sea, say ASEAN countries and China, should take the responsibility to negotiate measures and the deals on how to maintain the stability and the peace to serve not only for ourselves, but also for other countries, including the United States. So basically, the dual track negotiation is the key for the peaceful solution.
Well, no matter what mechanism we're talking about, I want the comments from the other two gentlemen very briefly. If exercises like this, joint military exercise like this going on, which is not necessarily going to create more confidence and mutual trust among important countries about the disputes, for example, China and the Philippines, or China and Japan, what would that mean eventually for the ultimate solution likely to be sought by negotiations? Or we are only decreasing the chances of results of negotiations by just playing with fire? Just let it be. Ambassador Volker.
2 points. One, I think that instead of trust, what I would talk about is predictability. In international relations, you need to understand the perspective of the other side and what their actions are likely to be.
All right.
I think that these sorts of exercises help increase some predictability. Second, you need a balance in the real world, on the ground or in the water, as a basis for successful negotiations. If there's an imbalance, one side will always press an advantage.
All right. Professor Heydarian?
Yeah, you have to combine engagement with deterrence. I think engagement alone without deterrence capability means you have no leverage. And for countries like the Philippines, who have limited military capabilities, they feel that in order for them to have leverage in their dealings with China, they have to develop their military capabilities and have maximum support from other countries. I think it's also very important for countries to maintain high-level institutionalized dialogue. And it's very sad that the Philippines and China have actually experienced a collapse in their high-level dialogue. President Xi Jinping and President Aquino have not held a single formal summit together.
Right.
And it's also important for countries in the region to develop confidence-building measures and hotlines, which again the Philippines and China have not developed. And hopefully that will be improved in coming months. And lastly, I would say that with the arbitration outcome coming soon, the Philippines arbitration case against China, then there's a hope that international law could be also a way for us to move forward.
I'm not sure whether arbitrations and necessarily military exercises is going to increase China's confidence in having further ties with the Philippines. But Mr. Yang, you know this better than I do, so help us to understand what attitude should China have and what attitude should China have in the future?
Well, firstly, regarding to arbitration, China take a strong opposition and take any attention to about that, because that is the international law. And secondly, as I mentioned, the more military involvement by the United States, the more military pressures jointly made by the related countries, the more military efforts will be made by China. That's absolutely clearly. And on the other hand, China has more concern than any other country else about the peace and stabilities. Just look at the situation. 80% of the cargoes and transportation in South China Sea relating to Chinese economy. So we really hope peaceful solution for peace and stability.